Okay. So thanks everybody for being here, and we'll start. So this is a very special occasion for the ISGAP family. This is a book launch, a virtual book launch. Unfortunately, we don't have wine and cheese here, but feel free to open some wine and cheese in your homes. Um, so this is really the book launch of a very important book. It's called Poisoning the Wells, and it's written by two esteemed scholars in the field of anti-Semitism. First, we're going to hear from Corinne Blackmer. Corinne is a professor of English and the director of Judaic Studies at Southern Connecticut State University. She's the author of many books and works, including Queering Anti-Zionism, Academic Freedom, the LGBTQ Intellectuals, Israel-Palestine Campus Activism. She's currently working on a family memoir about her grandmother, who was an abortionist before Roe versus Wade. So, Corinne, thank you for being here. And also, Andrew Pessin is with us. Andrew is a professor of philosophy at Connecticut College, and he's a campus bureau editor of Allgemeiner. He's a professor of philosophy and the editor, among other things, of Anti-Zionism on Campus, The Jewish God Question, as well as 3 novels. His most recent being Nevergreen, a satirical account of campus cancel culture and its impact on Jews. And for more information, you can go to his website, which I urge you to do, which is www.andrewpessin.com. And today we're going to launch the book, Poisoning the Wells. And it's the first book that ISGAP published in an academic book series on contemporary anti-Semitism with Academic Studies Press, which is a good publishing house out of Oxford. And just very briefly, Poisoning the Wells is about anti-Semitism in the United States and how it's been on the rise, especially on the extreme left and the radical right and within political Islam, and that expressions of this oldest hatred is increasingly prevalent in popular culture, where they're spread by politicians, entertainers, celebrities, and the media, and social justice activists, as well as religious leaders, and also within the university context. Once Jews regarded the United States as the Goldene Medina, the golden land where they could escape persecution and finally be free. However, this dream has not been realized, and major trends are moving in the opposite direction. The book Poisoning the Wells, which I really recommend, it's a group of leading scholars analyze contemporary anti-Semitism in the United States. So this is really a celebration, if you will, for it's our first book in our book series, and it's an honor that Andrew and Corinne did the book under the auspices of ISGAP. And I turn the floor to you, Corinne. Would you like to start off with your comments and then followed by Andrew?
Andrew, weren't you supposed to start off?
Okay,
And
sorry.
Charles was supposed to?
I think I'll go first.
Okay,
Thank
sure. Feel free.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you, Charles. And
Thank you.
you know, under normal circumstances, a book launch is a celebratory and happy occasion, but it just feels very somber and dark to me, unfortunately. We are very proud of the book, but the fact that it needed to be assembled in the first place, and the fact that it's so unbelievably timely, is not a matter of celebration, unfortunately. These are difficult times for all of us, and I hope everybody is coping. We are just barely, I would say. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit about what motivated us to write the book, or how we came to write the book, or rather assemble the book. We are editors of the volume. We have a dozen or so very esteemed collaborators, and we wrote an introduction to it as well. So I'm going to talk about how we came to put this book together and how things have evolved since this book originally appeared. So I know my journey into this area began with a personal experience. I've always been very pro-Israel, but pretty much on the side affair, occasional social media posting, until in my own experience back in 2015, I became the target of a campaign for standing up for Israel. I was very savagely attacked in various ways. And that was an experience that opened my eyes and made me see quite clearly that anti-Zionism just is anti-Semitism. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. And whatever intellectual nuance people like to apply to distinguish anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism, it just doesn't fly. Happily, I responded to that by becoming energized and sort of making this area something of a full-time affair. I spent the next couple of years editing and assembling a volume called Anti-Zionism on Campus, which was largely case studies, mostly case studies, seeing the alarming trend, coming to see that, in fact, as I understood in 2015, that many major campus communities really didn't like the Jews very much. So that book, 2018, that's how I met Corinne. She was one of the esteemed contributors to that volume. I see at least one or two others in the audience today. It's nice to have you with us. That was 2018. Things seem so peaceful and calm in retrospect, looking back to 2018. To me, it felt like we were in a crisis then, unknowing what was about to come in the years to follow. When Corinne originally proposed the current volume, now named Poisoning the Wells, I think it was back in late 2017 or so, I jumped right in. The trajectory to me already was clear, especially on campuses, which of course serve as incubators to larger society. And as we began to think about the volume and consider what topics to cover, over the next couple of years, we watched that hostility to Jews only grow, even as there was a major spate of anti-Jewish violence, not merely the ongoing assaults of religious Jews in Brooklyn, which continue to this day and going on for years, but of course, some major episodes of violence. 2018, 2019 was Pittsburgh and Poway and Muncie and New Jersey, etc. By 2021, it was clear to me that campuses not only didn't like the Jews, they actually really, really hated the Jews. And I say that particularly in response to the war that Hamas started in May of 2021. And looking at the campus response then, the outpouring of outrage at Israel for responding to Hamas's attacks and aggression. And particularly there, I saw this thing that was so painful and so dark, and it was really the harbinger of what was to come. The trope of Jewish supremacy started appearing, particularly in some of these letters that academics were writing to protest Israel, like the women and gender studies and even Jewish studies scholars, hundreds of people signing these letters condemning Israel for its program of Jewish supremacy. It was right out of Goebbels' propaganda, Nazi propaganda. I was so stunned to see that. But of course, I'm not so stunned now because it was clear where things were going. That's for the title of the volume, Poisoning the Wells. We credit Corinne for that wonderful title. Of course, has a twofold meaning. It refers both to the medieval anti-Semitic trope that Jews were responsible for poisoning the wells and ultimately spreading the plague through that, a type of conspiracy theory which continues to evolve and grow, and we see many versions of that today in various anti-Israel conspiracy theories. And of course, it's also the name of a classic logical fallacy where instead of engaging with the argument of your opponent, you try to delegitimize them or silence them or exclude them in advance, which is, of course, one of the major tactics of the anti-Israel crowd on campuses and elsewhere. Since this book came into being in 2021, things, of course, have only gotten worse. After October 7th, a few weeks after October 7th, I wrote an article whose title was something along the following lines. It's not that campuses didn't like the Jews or really hated the Jews, but actively wanted them dead, right? It just continued to escalate. And the Jews, Israeli Jews certainly, but also all Zionists, including those who are members of their own campus communities, to whom they chanted phrases such as globalize the Intifada and by any means necessary, and so on after October 7th. What we saw, of course, on campuses and then elsewhere after October 7th was not shock and outrage at the barbarity of that terrorist attack, but celebration of it, endorsement of it, and calls for more on campuses where people are supposed to be educated and literate and know better. Campuses that are producing the next generation of leaders, right? So what's on campus today will be disseminated widely in the next 10 to 15 years ahead. What's going on campuses is that we have an incubator producing hordes of young, hate-filled minds that will go on to take over the media, the law, government, NGOs, and but then become professors to pass the hatred on to the next generation. Though the trajectory was clear, when this happened, it was just the next step from May 21st Jewish supremacy tropes. It was still shocking just to see it, and I still am suffering from post-traumatic syndrome from the campuses, not to mention October 7th itself. The reaction from students and faculty all over major campuses, as I said, support, endorsement, celebration, jubilation, and this was even before Israel began its response some days later. They were celebrating the murders, not protesting the Israeli response, which is, of course, what it's morphed into at this point. First out of the gate, many of you will be aware, 34 Harvard student groups put out a statement on the afternoon of October 7th, while the massacre was still ongoing, blaming it all on Israel, essentially saying these people all had it coming. Faculty responses. Cornell professor called it exhilarating. And again, these are in the several days after October 7th, before Israel has begun its true response. Cornell professor calling it exhilarating. Columbia professor calling it awesome. NYU professor calling it life and future affirming. CUNY's Mark Lamont Hill, well-known anti-Semite, casually saying, well, decolonization isn't just a theory, right? It's good what happened there. It's a form of decolonization. Student responses, Students for Justice in Palestine being at the heart of it, but of course they've got many, many allies. In fact, just about all the progressive groups on all the major campuses are allies with SJP, but SJP sort of leads the way on here. They, by the next day, had put out posters celebrating the resistance, which is, of course, their sanitized word for the barbaric torture, rape, and slaughter of Jewish civilians and children and elderly. So celebrating the resistance and then calling to bring the resistance to campuses. This is the language that they used. They called for a whole a day of resistance later that first week, openly calling for and endorsing violence against Jews. That's what the resistance means to them, and calling to bring it to campuses. And in case you missed the point, they illustrated these calls with posters that featured hang gliders, the homicidal hang gliders from the Nova, attacking the Nova Music Festival. These led to massive rallies on many campuses, all the major campuses, right? Calling chants of intifada, globalize the intifada revolution by any means necessary. Open calls for violence here now on our campuses. Faculty members participating in that, administrators mostly silent, right? Or when they finally said something, some days later, it was mealy-mouthed statements that were deploring violence on all sides, right? Almost no administrators, presidents and deans, and especially deans of diversity, equity, and inclusion, who you would think would be supportive of the attacked minority, but in fact, conversation we can have later, are largely promoters of the attacks on the oppressed minority, which is the Jews. Administrators, mostly silent. Almost none of them could condemn the Hamas violence. Almost none of them could use the word Jew to talk about the victim. All of that continued, and of course, only got worse as the semester wore on. Ongoing rallies, takeovers of administrative buildings, harassment of Jewish students, vandalism of Jewish symbols and institutions, mezuzot being torn down from dorm rooms, and Israeli flags set on fire, Hillels and Chabads vandalized, defaced with graffiti, several cases of arson, numerous physical assaults, Jewish students forced to barricade themselves in libraries and dorm rooms against angry mobs. The Harvard Chabad was instructed by Harvard not to leave their oversized menorah outside during Hanukkah overnight because Harvard couldn't protect it. Harvard, with its $50 billion endowment, couldn't find a way to, put a security guard next to their Chabad. So Jews being forced to cower inside. These are our campuses, and it goes on to this day. As part of my job on the Allgemeiner, I strongly commend the Allgemeiner to you. If you want to stay informed, especially on campus events and all events concerning Israel and Jews, please do subscribe to the free daily newsletter. But my job as Allgemeiner has me scouring the internet daily for what's going on campuses. And it's going on to this day. There are numerous campuses where students are occupying administration buildings. There are rallies. There are assaults on Jewish students 5 months into this, 6 months into this. Result, of course, lawsuits galore, which we can talk about in the Q&A section if you like. So here's what's happening. Here's where we are. Campuses have become unbelievably, overwhelmingly hostile to Jewish students and faculty members, to the point where Jews are essentially being driven from the universities. It's not just campuses, of course. Tends to be my focus. It's all over major cities in the United States and Europe. It's coming from the right. It's coming from the left. It's in every major institution: churches, media, NGOs, medicine, law, education. It's in K through 12 education. If you're following the news, it's particularly salient in the Muslim community and in the Black community and even the Latino community. Assaults on Jewish property beyond campuses, again, Chabad houses, Jewish synagogues and federations, swastikas everywhere, bomb threats. There was more than one huge anti-Israel rally in Brooklyn, and in the heart of an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, and the police told the Jews that they couldn't protect them, so the Jews should just stay indoors on Shabbat with their doors locked. This is Brooklyn in 2023. It was in the fall. London, of course, if you follow that, is weekly rallies of tens or hundreds of thousands of people leaving destruction in their wake, typically. And in a particularly salient moment, I have a video of this at the University of North Carolina. One of the anti-Israel rallies there, someone with a camera zoomed in on a young woman screaming exuberantly, "We are all Hamas, we are all Hamas." And nobody around her seemed to disagree with that sentiment. So that's where we are in March of 2024. It strikes me as a dire existential situation. And our book is designed to at least document and analyze the phenomena. There are a number of chapters focusing on the campus. We have a number of chapters just focusing on the right-wing manifestations of this, and a number of chapters focusing on the left-wing manifestations of this. It's literally coming at us from every direction. So these are dark and difficult times. And with that, I'll end my remarks and turn the floor over to Corinne.
Thank you, Andrew.
Charles, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say thank Andrew, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. When the Jews are in trouble, democracy is in trouble. And I think that's one of the points we made in the introduction to our volume, Poisoning the Wells. And one thing we pointed out in the introduction was that Jews used to look upon the United States when they immigrated here as the Goldene Medina, the Golden Land. And it was a place full of promise that had been free of anti-Semitism, where Jews could live freely and at their ease and not be worried about these sorts of things. That era has ended. And I think that Franklin Foer put it well in the Atlantic the other day when he said, I'm sure most of us have read his article, that a golden age of Jews is ending. So this anti-Semitism has reached the shores of the United States definitively. And I'm sure that historians will look back at this period and ask themselves what happened and why. And while I have some theories, I think that what our book did was that it documented and chronicled the middle phases of this phenomena. One of the things that we focused on in the introduction was the outbreak of violence that occurred in an earlier Hamas encounter, war between Israel and Hamas in 2021, where there was a lot of rioting in the streets and there was a lot of violence against Jews at that time. But what I'd like to do in the time allotted to me is go through and briefly characterize the various chapters in the book and to give you sort of an idea of the scope and the content of the book, and some of the things that we're concerned with, because we tried to get as much scope as possible. And the first chapter of Poisoning the Wells is called Anti-Semitism in Jewish American Academia, which seems very prescient, and by Edward Alexander, who's no longer with us, but Professor Alexander was talking about the way that many Jewish studies departments, perhaps even most Jewish studies departments, are full of Jewish professors who are actively or passively anti-Israel. And this is not wall to wall, but very, very common. And it's common among academics in academia, in Jewish academics and academia in general. And it is part of what I perceive as this culture of conformism in the academy, where, okay, 5 people think something and you go along with them, whatever your qualms might be or your reservations, you go along with them. And I think this has to do also with the fact that academics are fairly busy people. They may have a divorce going on in their private lives. They've got to finish an article on Shakespeare and a pile of papers from students. And somebody comes by their office door and says, would you sign this petition on Palestine, condemning Israel for its aggression against the Palestinians? And in their distraction, yeah, they say, sure, okay. And I think that a lot of, not all, but much of the anti-Israel sentiment on campuses is sort of go along to get along kind of stuff amongst many people. Not all people. There's the leaders, and they are extremely impassioned. They're true believers. But what Professor Alexander is talking about in his piece is about people who are both sort of bystanders and onlookers, and people who are impassioned haters of Israel, all of them Jewish, and the ways in which self-hatred manifests itself nowadays. He has an interesting quote at the beginning of his article where he says that, you know, rabbis used to say, when you feel uncomfortable being Jewish, you call yourself a Zionist. And now it's like when you feel uncomfortable about being a Jew, you call yourself an anti-Zionist. So that's Professor Alexander's piece. The next article I'd like to talk about is Amy Ellman's article on left anti-Semitism. And pinkwashing anti-Semitism. She has a fascinating theory that ultimately in women's studies, we can trace anti-Semitism back to this moment in the early 90s where feminists rejected a critique of pornography and embraced a lot of Nazi symbols as sexual symbols, and became interested in BDS and S&M. And that this bled into or contributed to this environment where anti-Semitism really flourished. A very provocative, very interesting argument about the origins of anti-Semitism, but specifically within the women's movement, and that it had to do with a kind of a throwing over of concerns even about rape. And what's interesting is that you can see this in somebody like Judith Butler nowadays, who kind of gave this smirky smile when she was asked about the rapes of Israeli women by Hamas in October 7th. And she wanted proof that this had happened in a way that she would never ask for proof in another context. Miriam Ellman, who is the leader, the executive director of AEN, Academic Engagement Network, an incredible organization, writes about left anti-Semitism, the rhetoric and activism of Jewish Voices for Peace. And there's a few salient points about Jewish Voices for Peace I'd like to point out. One is that there are very few Jews in Jewish Voices for Peace. And the second thing, that they just use that as a, as Jews who are anti-Zionists are used. And so therefore, as a cover for anti-Semitism, I can't be anti-Semitic since I'm Jewish. A idea that Professor Alexander really attacks in his piece on anti-Zionist Jewish professors. And Jewish Voices for Peace is Southern Poverty Law Center regards them as a hate group. And they are. And what they do is they go about and they very aggressively appropriate Jewish rituals and symbols and holidays. For example, they'll turn Passover into a celebration of Palestinian resistance to Jews. And so that's Jewish Voices for Peace. They're very, very aggressively anti-Semitic, and that's the sort of thing that they're engaged in doing. Then there is a chapter that I wrote with Charles Rubin and Joel Finkelstein, both of whom, well, actually, I don't know about Charles Rubin, although I think this is the case. Joel Finkelstein currently works for, he had worked for the Office of Civil Rights, and now he works for Homeland Security and the FBI, tracking anti-Semitism on the web. He's a computer genius, and I wrote this article with him about anti-Semitism on the web. And what's happening on the web is fascinating. And he said, what happens on the web, it happens first on the web, and then it manifests itself in general culture. One of the things that we found was that the left and the right had become united on the web, that you had Islamists joining hands with left-wing anti-Zionists on the web. And also that the volume of anti-Semitism was going way up on the web as he was tracking it and tracking where it was coming from and where, whether or not people were intending actual violence and harm as opposed to just chattering. And he noticed that it had become very prevalent during Trump's administration and at various points in it, like with Charlottesville, and recently it's just been through the roof, and was correlated with October 7th, which surprised him initially. But I would argue that there was two phases of October 7th. One, the one that happened immediately, in which I think that Peter Beinhart's and Judith Butler's views of a unitary single state Jewish state, Palestinian Jewish state, went up in flames and was replaced by a all-Palestinian idea of an all-Palestinian state in which the Jews would be thrown out. And that happened before Israel's action against the Jews. I'm sorry, against the Palestinians in Gaza. I'm just going to move a little bit more quickly. Intersectionality in the Jews has to do with the fact that intersectionality is developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, never incorporated Jews because of the structure of anti-Semitism, which is that Jews precisely are oppressed around this notion of privilege. And that's not how intersectionality works. It's the oppressed versus the oppressors. James Kirchick, very brilliant man, talks about the reemergence of Black anti-Semitism. Since he wrote that piece, that has really accelerated. There is enormous amount of anti-Semitism in the Black community, particularly among certain leaders of it. Kanye West, most recently Candace Owens, and a large number of other people, sort of social influencers and celebrities. There's a couple of pieces here which talk about people's specific experiences before and after anti-Semitism became prevalent on certain campuses. Melissa Landa talks about her experiences at Oberlin in the 70s and 80s, where she could celebrate being Jewish and celebrate being Zionist. And that is no way would be possible at Oberlin at this point in time. Carrie Nelson, who is a brilliant man and has done a lot of writing about this topic, talks about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and personal boycott movements. And he calls this microaggressions. And what happens is that it's things like where it's very hard to find proof of the anti-Semitism, but it's there, where professors will simply refuse to write a letter of recommendation for a Jewish student, for example, or they refuse to hire someone who they know is Jewish, or is, unless they declared themselves specifically as anti-Zionist. It's this form of personalized aggression against Jews and Zionists. And many people, and Israelis, and many people announce themselves in one way or another during either their interviews for a position or in their work as anti-Zionists. And students have a lot of trouble getting letters of recommendation from many faculty members if they're doing Jewish topics because of this fact. There is a piece we also did on myths surrounding the relationship between Jews and Muslims. And I heard a lot about this. I went recently to the city council meeting in Bridgeport, in which the Arab population was saying, oh, Jews and Muslims got along perfectly well before the creation of the State of Israel. Well, that's simply a lie. They were dhimmis, and there was a lot of persecution of Jews, particularly as time went on. So they take a look at that myth and sort of deconstruct that myth. And Andrew Pessin wrote a fascinating piece on how people can be anti-Semitic and avoid becoming conscious of that. It's a sort of unconscious, reflexive, automatic anti-Semitism that they're not even aware that they're bearing. And I have seen this again and again and again. And if they're made aware of this, they deny it. And it's not something that they want to admit to. It's sort of like the same thing where someone says, oh, I'm not racist, somebody else is racist, but I'm not really racist. And he calls it good people gone wild. And it's the same structure of this sort of unconscious, self-deceiving racism or anti-Semitism in this case. We also had an article that had to do with right-wing anti-Semitism that was about anti-Semitism amongst hate groups before and after the 2016 election. And what happened, we also examined this in our piece on on anti-Semitism on the web. Anti-Semitism on the web was an interesting piece to write because both the right and the left were well represented on the web. And in this piece, it's mainly right-wing anti-Semitism. And after the 2016 election, right-wing anti-Semitism became very, very prevalent. And it became okay to be an anti-Semite in public. As we saw in Charlottesville, where people were not even wearing masks anymore, they were just openly anti-Semitic. The next piece has to do with justice, Students for Justice in Palestine. And I feel this is a very interesting piece because it really concerns an earlier manifestation of SJP, where they were doing a little bit more to disguise their anti-Semitism and their anti-Zionism. They felt the need to put some emphasis on their Muslim identities and also their advocacy for Palestinian people per se. Now the emphasis has fallen entirely on anti-Semitism in Students for Justice in Palestine. And it's simply fascinating. Occasionally, Students for Justice in Palestine would complain about or talk about South Sudan or the situation in Syria or other instances where Muslims had attacked either Christians or indigenous people or other Muslims. And they would actually discuss this. That is gone. That simply is no longer present, at least as far as I can tell, in Students for Justice in Palestine. They're wholly focused on Jews and Palestinians, as their name would indicate, except that they used to have some other focal points as well. Finally, or penultimately, Kenneth Walser did a piece on UC's principles against intolerance and how they would operate to aid Jewish students. And it's a sad piece to read. Ken is a brilliant man. It's a sad piece to read because it's failed so miserably. UC campuses in California are some of the most anti-Semitic places of colleges in the United States. And he tried to articulate, using a lot of reason, this point. The final piece in the volume, Dexter Van Zyl, takes a look at the rise, or I should say the reemergence of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism among liberal Protestant churches. And he's asking himself, why has this become so prevalent in recent years? And that's accelerated as well. And he says it's less about the Jews and more about a kind of a tussle or a contest between conservative evangelicals on the one hand and liberal Protestants on the other. Liberal Protestants used to be the major denomination in the United States, and every year they're losing more power as Christian evangelicals are gaining more and more power. Christian evangelicals are very pro-Israel, and to the extent, and what's happening is a sort of dynamic where the more pro-Israel Christian evangelicals become, the more anti-Zionist liberal Protestant denominations come. And so you see this phenomena where liberal Protestant churches, which used to be very pro-Israel, are increasingly anti-Israel, with some fervently anti-Israel, to the point of seeing Jesus as a Palestinian. So that is our volume. And as you can tell from my discussion, it's quite varied. And it covers a lot of ground. So we're open for what are we doing next?
Now we can have some Q&A, some conversation as best we can virtually. I'd also like to say the piece on Students for Justice in Palestine, I wrote it with my colleague David Patterson, so we're
Oh, right.
happy
Yeah.
to be part of the book. Yeah, and we have a new volume of this report will be coming out in the next few weeks, an updated volume on how they're connected to Hamas and etc. So I guess my one question is, why do you for both of you, why do you think this is happening now? Why this explosion in 2024? What is in the social, economic, political, cultural condition? Why now?
You want to answer that first, Andy?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I think, of course, the immediate trigger is the violence of Hamas, which allows the floodgates to open, but no pun intended, right? But nothing would come out unless there was material that was bursting to come out, once those gates opened. And so I think there's two main factors. And again, my focus tends to be on the campus, so I'll answer it from that perspective. First of all, there's been just about 20 years now of the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, and Students for Justice in Palestine, which have now gone to establish chapters on 200 plus campuses in, I think, North America, something like that. So they've just grown. And what they've done for the last 20 years, and especially for the last 10 years, is they've become big and they've formed the national organization. I think in 2011 was their first national meeting. So they're now organized and clearly well-funded. They've been soaking campuses in lies about Israel for 10 years, and we all know the standard lies, everything from the genocide to ethnic cleansing to apartheid and so on. I think that has a cumulative effect. And a lot of the students who have go through their college years being soaked in these lies, well, we are now seeing the first generation of those people disseminate into the world, and the young people who are taking over the New York Times, for example, just to use one prominent example, these lies are now manifesting themselves in the world outside the campus. Combined with that, I think we have the perfect storm is, of course, the rise of, we'll call it the progressive movement. That's a nicer word for it. The woke movement is, I think, has a little bit negative connotations these days, but the progressive woke movement that has taken over campuses over the last 20 years, but particularly in the last 10 years as well, has helped spread this ideology, which in a word, as Corinne was mentioning, discussing one of the essays, the intersectionality essay, that basically Jews are white oppressors and all marginalized people, and that includes all the identity groups, the Black groups, the queer groups, the Latino groups, the Muslim groups, etc. All of them see themselves as oppressed by Jews on campus, and even in America at large, as this movement has taken over industries, entire industries, the woke movement, lots of people now see Jews as fundamentally the whitest of the white oppressors. And so you combine that idea with these years of lies that Israeli Jews are basically Jewish supremacists. There's that trope. Jewish supremacists oppressing Palestinians, as American Jews support that and also are busy oppressing people of color and all marginalized groups here. You've got this perfect storm of just hatred of Jews permeating most of the major campuses, and it's been going on long enough now that a couple of generations of college students have now graduated and are taking over institutions like law schools and medicine, et cetera, and the New York Times, the media, and so forth. So I think the pump has been primed, and all it took, we saw it in 2021 when Hamas started that war. The response to that was so outrageous at the time. I was shocked. I even wrote a song about anti-Semitism. I was so shocked by it then. that's the thing that triggers it, because now they can release this hatred of Jews, but of course it's cloaked in this human rights language. We are standing up for the Palestinians. We are fighting for human rights, the human rights of the Palestinians. But what's driving it all is just deep, profound hatred of the Jews that's been percolating really for up to 2 decades on our campuses. So that's my analysis.
Well, thanks. Corinne?
I think it's an excellent analysis. I don't know how much more I want to add to Andy, maybe a couple of notes. One is the one note I'd like to address is the increasingly large numbers of foreign students from the Middle East who are steeped in cultures of anti-Semitism in their home countries. And you know, I lived just down the block to Yale, to a number of rallies they had, and a large number of people were either outsiders or Middle Eastern students. So that's one factor, and that's been accelerating because there's been a larger and larger number of foreign students coming here. The second thing is the influence of foreign money, which I think has been Qatari money and other foreign money that has influenced cultures on campuses, and that has accelerated. The third factor is COVID. And the isolation and the inwardness and the antisocial, and I'm not saying it caused it, just made it worse. The atmosphere and the dynamics of COVID, in addition to the atmosphere and dynamics of this woke culture. And I would say Trump and Netanyahu both. I mean, to the large extent that Netanyahu was seen as in bed with Trump, that it wasn't a great look. And I keep on thinking about Israeli PR and hoping that, for the good Lord, that they would get some sort of better woman to be their spokesperson. Because all they have is Ashkenazi men who are very, and it's not a good look. It's not a great, I mean, they're not good at PR. And so all these factors together, including all the stuff that Andy has mentioned. And at last, I'd like to mention that anti-Semitism has always been like this. It's always been throwing the Jews out off the side of the boat and into an area where they were very isolated. And I think a lot of Jews currently feel extremely isolated in the same way they did in the 30s. And this has happened before in the United States. And so here we are again.
We should probably just mention that ISGAP has led the way in documenting the influx of foreign money onto campuses. They've got some wonderful reports on that, showing how the volume of it and the influence of it, and it's worth checking that information out.
Absolutely.
And actually next week we have a report coming out about Cornell. We found $10 billion with a B in undocumented money. So
Wow,
I'll be in a few days. Crazy.
That's impressive.
Crazy. But they're more impressive than us. We're just catching up. Yeah. Ellen Cannon, you have a comment or question? You're muted, Ellen.
Thank you. Cool. Again, Mazal Tov on this wonderful contribution. Both you and Corinne and Andrew have made possible, and especially the support that you've received from ISGAP. We're so grateful for what ISGAP is assisting us in doing. I'd like to make 3 points and possibly have you comment on. One of the things that you mentioned was a personal boycott, such as a student asking for a letter of recommendation, especially not merely because they're Jewish, but they want to take a junior year in Israel, and the person says, I'm not writing a letter for you. I've been experiencing a personal boycott, and I'm fearful that it will spread. It takes the form of students coming into my classroom, and always right in front of me, there is no notebook, no pens out, no computers out, and they sit with their arms folded as a form of protest because this person is supporting Israel. So I call that a personal boycott. Also, I would like to recommend something. One of the most important books on evangelicals is by Tim Alberta, The Power and the Glory. It is brilliant. But the most important phase of the book is about that evangelicals have now adopted, large portions of them, Christian nationalism, which is an extreme right-wing group, and they articulate that God has sent them Trump as their personal savior. And the analogies of how people responded to Hitler, and also about reproductions in order to do what Hitler requires, is very, very, very important for, I think, you to look at. And thirdly, after 9/11, the Muslim American community was subject to enormous discrimination. And that, I would like to suggest, hasn't ended. And somehow, I think our focus needs to go wider in the real world. For example, in one of my classes, we're studying a very interesting paradox. On the one hand, because of October 7th, you have new political voice for the American Muslim community in their message to the President of the United States and the Democratic Party. And if you live in the Midwest, this is a very major voice. But at the same time, what we find is a movement that has not been studied enough by our community. It is an anti-Muslim movement called the Sharia law movement, in which, again, at a time when their power and influence is beginning to congeal, there remains an attack simultaneously. And as Jews, we understand this, the paradoxes of Jewish so-called power and the difficulty that we're having. But I make these three comments to suggest we have miles to go in our contribution to understanding to a wider audience of what is going on. And I said I was going to make 3 points, but I'm going to make 4.
You want to turn down the blind?
And okay, and my fourth point is the following. I am very privileged to speak very regularly to parents whose kids are in college, and they're 100% Jewish audience, and they have huge concerns. Where there is no knowledge or concern is about the different experience of Jewish faculty. And for them, all that matters is the very close present without the long-term damage of those of us who are witnessing that future Jewish generations are going to experience far greater anti-Semitism because of what they're learning now. How can we really reach an audience to have them join us in much more detailed numbers with knowledge that we haven't achieved thus far? Again, mazel tov on this wonderful contribution.
Thank you, Ellen. Corinne, Andrew.
That was a lot to chew on there. Let me, instead of answering or addressing the specific points, brings up a couple of things. One is, you mentioned this, it's a wonderful Jewish trade. Jews in large numbers have always cared about the marginalized and the oppressed, not least because American Jews in particular, not least because of our own experience in facing that and overcoming it. And, you know, Jews are overwhelmingly liberal or democratic and even progressive, and we populate these movements. And this comes to a head in the, of course, the DEI movement, which is prominent on campuses and actually throughout industries, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is a very powerful, potent left-wing progressive movement to protect all the marginalized, etc. And Jews have been long drawn to it. But a paradox here and a problem here is DEI is really, to its core, antagonistic to Jews these days, not least because Jews have made it in America on average overall, right? We overcame the oppression of the first half of the 20th century, and we had our golden age where we were liked and celebrated. And as a result, we're now being punished for that because we made it, we were successful, and we're classified as oppressors. So we have a lot of Jews who, hey, and I'm in this crowd. Like on paper, I want to be supportive of the DEI movement in all sorts of ways, or at least many of its goals, if not always its methods and means. But the DEI movement is at its core antagonistic to Jews. So I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I'm a lifelong Democrat, but I don't think I can vote Democrat at this particular point. I'm torn. Most of what the Democratic Party stands for me personally, I stand for, but I also stand for the Jews and for Israel, and I no longer feel that the Democratic Party, in general, obviously there's many exceptions, stand for that. So this is a tough situation Jews are in. Our values lead us one way, but our self-defense and our dignity lead us another way, and I don't see a clear solution to that at the moment.
Well said, Corinne.
No, I don't have anything in particular to add to what Andy and Ellen have said. So we'll move on to the next question.
Okay, thanks. So Mr. Murray Rubin, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself if possible. Cool. Thank you. No. Daphne, can you help unmute Murray? Thanks.
Murray, you have to accept our invitation to unmute, or you can do it by clicking on the top of your box.
Okay,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we hear you. Go ahead. If you
I'm
can
a
be succinct,
person-
because we're running out of time.
yeah, I know that. And my
Thanks.
computer ran out of juice, and for some reason, I've been working at it. There is no question in my mind that the fight against anti-Semitism isn't working. We're doing the same thing. We have organizations, and I belong to most of them. If I wasn't 93 years old, I'd list them, but I feel that we are reactors. We react to an anti-Semite incident, but we don't get to the problem. So I'm giving you a solution that it's not a brilliant solution, but there are 0.2% of Jews in the world. And thankfully, most people are not anti-Semitic. They're indifferent. If a Jew suffers anti-Semitism, so what? It isn't their problem. But many, many people, both Muslims and Christians, go to places of worship And my suggestion is that we send groups to different churches and mosques to talk about our problem and to give them the history of anti-Semitism. You may think they know it, but they don't. And I'll tell you something else. You're going to be surprised. The Jews know about the Holocaust, but that's it. They don't know how far back it goes. So you've got to get in touch with the mosques and the priests and ask if on one of their days of worship, when they are finished, they allow you to give a little talk about what Jews are facing. Most of the people in the audience
Mr.
are
Rubin,
not.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
if you can ask a concise question, I'd be grateful, because we have many other.
Or I can actually just comment on what
Sure,
was,
go ahead.
was said,
Thank
if you
you,
don't
Mr.
mind.
Rubin. Andrew,
Thank
go
you,
ahead.
Mr.
Thank you,
Rubin.
Mr. Rubin.
For your question. But I think this gets at, and I appreciate the suggestion you're making, and we need to fight on all fronts. There's a lot of things that haven't been working. We need to try new things, etc. But this also gets at yet one more factor in this perfect explosion that we're seeing, which is and this is a problem in the Jewish community at large. All too many Jewish students know nothing of their heritage, of their history, not just the history of anti-Semitism, the history of the Jewish people, the history of Israel. Students come to campus and they know, on average, and they know nothing. And they're not in a position to answer the lies of the activists. And this is something we need to fix as a community from the ground up. We need to make Jewish education affordable, subsidize it. We need to raise kids who know their history, know their tradition, are proud of and love their tradition, and then they're ready to defend their tradition. But all too many Jewish students come, they know nothing. They hear about how evil Israel is, and it's persuasive to them because they literally have no resources to defend it.
Yeah, very important point. So thank you, Mr. Rubin, and Andrew, thank you for a very key response. People should take note. Michelle, Ben, you have a comment or question? Please be concise.
I'm trying. I have 4 points I want to make. I'll try to be
4
concise.
points. Oh, Lord.
Okay. First of all,
okay.
I wanted to build on what the previous speaker just said. I think that one of our
lecture
problems.
hour.
Pardon me?
Go ahead.
I think that we don't make enough of the alliances that we do have. I was just thinking about Dumasani Washington, for instance, who I'm sure many of you know of him, who spends his time going into Black communities, talking to Black ministers, sort of correcting the perceptions. And I think that we don't align ourselves enough. I heard him recently speak about a group called Cure, and they apparently are doing something similar. And I think we need to, as Jews, try to find the alliances. There are Muslim Palestinian Israelis who are speaking out. We need to align ourselves with them and use them as strength. That's number one. Number two, I think that I'm actually asking a question on this. 2 things. This whole thing, we address the split in Christianity. There's also this whole thing that came kind of as a spin-off with Candace Owens about Christ as King and how that's being used. And my understanding is that many Christians do start to feel like they are victims also, and they don't align their sense of victimhood with our sense of victimhood. It's a separate kind of thing. And again, I think we need to communicate better about that, and before they go even further, especially in the mainstream Christian denominations. I don't know that that's going to be effective, but it's a different approach. My third thing is I'm a poet, and I've been writing. I have a whole collection of poems called Words When There Are No Words, in response to October 7th. I think that one of our issues as Jews is we're very factual, and we're academics too, some of us. We're very factually oriented, history, whatever. If they only knew, education. all good and true. But what the other side is doing is appealing to emotions. You know, Jews are the bad guys with whatever is a problem here. Humanitarian aid. You know, the words get twisted and turned. I mean, who's going to turn down babies being killed? Of course, but they don't see that the Israeli babies being killed. So my point is that I think that we need to use more emotion. And what my poems have been about in October 7th is the emotional impact on us. You know, we all feel isolated, we all feel angry, we all feel frightened, but there's a great deal more. How is it changing how we perceive ourselves? And I think that needs to be addressed within the Jewish community before we can address some of the hate against us. I kind of rambled, I realize, but there are
Yeah.
several points that I wanted to make there. So I'm sorry.
Michelle, you made them quickly and concisely, and they're powerful, so thank you. And yeah, I think the way we perceive ourselves is very important. And I think especially in the United States, if I may, sort of the racialization of Jews is interesting. You know, we were exterminated for not being white, and now suddenly, as Andrew was saying, we're the epitome of white apartheid supremacy. And the clowns in our best universities are teaching this about our people. And we have our own notions of identity, of who we are, of how we relate to the other, the ethics of relating to the other. So I think we, as Andrew was saying, we should go deep into the wisdom of our culture, the living wisdom that we have access to, thankfully. We've not been erased because of colonialism. We have access to our wisdom, and we should really learn the beauty of who we are as the sages teach. So we have a lot to work with. We're blessed. All right, so there's room for maybe one more comment because we actually went over time. Does anybody have a comment or question? Take the last one. Okay, I don't see anybody. So also, if anybody would like to purchase the book, please write to the info@isgap.org and we'll send you instructions on how to purchase it. And we can help you do that. There were some questions in the chat. I think on Amazon, the Canadian Amazon, it's very expensive, but the US Amazon, it's not, it's less than half the price as a Canadian Amazon for some reason. But we can give you instructions on how to get a copy for an accurate price. So anyway, and really on behalf of everybody at ISGAP, Corinne and Andrew, thank you so much for your work and dedication, continued dedication to these issues. Maybe one day we'll open a Center on Anti-Semitism in some obscure history department, and this will all pass us by, this bad dream. But we have to be strong, and I think Andrew and Corinne gives us a lot of material to be, insightful material. We also know from our culture and heritage that knowledge is power, and the knowledge in this book will help us navigate the storm. So Andrew and Corinne, thank you so much for your work and continued strength and success in the work. We need your voices.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks for
Charles and
co-op.
ISGAP, and thank you to the audience for showing up. So thank you.
Be well. Take care, everybody. Stay strong.